Welcome to the Fitness Plus Technology Podcast for club owners, operators, and fitness professionals. Each week, host Bryan O'Rourke brings you an expert interview with a global influencer at the crossroads of fitness and technology. You gain the insights, tools, and inspiration you need to stay connected to the pulse for what matters most for your business in the age of exponential technologies.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. This is episode 153, and I'm so happy you're joining us today. I'm your host, Bryan O'Rourke. It is the beginning of September 1. I hope your summer was a good one as we approach fall. Some things I want to mention to you before we talk about our guest. If you're in Florida or anywhere in the world, really, October 7th in Tampa, Florida, is the Vertimax Summit, and I will have a link in the show notes. Check that out. There's some real interesting stuff, great speakers. It's a great event. Check it out. We'd love to have you there. You'll see the link in the show notes. So let's go forward with our guest today, who I just love. I love these guests that we've been having and always enjoy meeting new people and introducing them to you if you don't already know them and hearing their thoughts. And in this case, we're going to be talking with Jeff Dilts, who's the Vice President of Product Innovation and Marketing at Core Health and Fitness. Jeff has been in the industry a very long time. He's highly respected in understanding the fitness space and in particular about products, which he's overseen. He has a very in-depth background, starting as a regional fitness manager for Sports Club LA, where he was there for a number of years and had several stints, including work at NASM. And he's been with Star Trek and then ultimately Core for quite a number of years. Congrats, by the way, Jeff, on StairMaster being 40 years old. We talk about that a little bit. But Jeff shares his insights on trends in equipment and commercial fitness, what's going on, what he sees around that now in the future, and also as his involvement with the Fitness Industry Supplier Association. He sits on the board there. He has access to a lot of trend report information. And so I really think you're going to find his insights and thoughts of benefit and use. And we'll, of course, have his contact information and LinkedIn profile, et cetera, in the show notes if you want to check him out in more detail. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeff Dilts. Hello, listeners. And as I said in the intro, we have the privilege of having a good friend and well-respected colleague on the pod today, Jeff Dilts. Jeff, happy afternoon, my friend.
Bryan, it's great to see you. Very excited to be on with you. Looking forward to it.
Well, listen, I've talked about your career, both in facility operations, going back many years, although you look much younger than your resume would indicate. But you're interesting in your career from the standpoint of your hands-on career in operations. And then, for a substantial amount of time, with NASM on education and then getting into product development, innovation, you sit on the Fitness Industry Suppliers Association's FISA's board. You have a tremendous background of context in what's happening in the industry. So I thought today you could share with the listeners some of your thinking as to what's going on in the commercial space in general and with respect to some specific trends. And I know you have access to a lot of information, Jeff. So how do you feel about that conversation?
Well, it's interesting. And you hit on something. There is something about growing old in an industry. We see trends come, we see trends go. And, not to completely date myself, but going back to when I started in the industry, it was the days of Jack LaLanne's All-American Health Club. It was the days of Holiday Spa. And for those of the listeners that were around back then, in those days, they were weight rooms. They were big weight rooms, and quite often men had a weight room and women had their own weight room. There was no cardio in the gyms back then. Maybe a Monarch bike in a corner that no one really used. So over the past, 4 decades, seeing the ebb and flow of trends and how even science can generate trends has been pretty fascinating. And as you mentioned, we're in an interesting time now where the two biggest trends are probably, one is a massive resurgence or a renaissance of strength training, and the other is technology. So you've got kind of the thing that it all started with, which is pushing steel around, and what technology has brought to the table, and facility operators trying to understand the trends, trying to understand the new users, and trying to figure out how to use those tools and reinvent themselves it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah, you're really at the forefront of this. I know you study this quite intently, and in your job heading up product innovation for one of the largest commercial groups in the world, and we talked about some of this stuff. I thought we could explore some things like indoor cycling, for example. We saw that really explode, and talk about a integration of technology play. What do you see going on there right now, Jeff?
Well, it's from you as I've worked in different parts of the industry, as you mentioned, as an operator, as an educator, and as a product guy, and even now as a marketing guy, you see things through different lenses. And when group cycling began, the origin story of group cycling, I think everyone is familiar of that, with how it started. It was an amazing an experience, right? It was all about the experience created for that 40 minutes that you were on the bike. And there was a lot of visualization, and there was great music, and there was great choreography. But as kind of science evolves things over time, and the protocols for training become a little more sophisticated, and as you start to enter the era of tracking, of being rewarded for the work you did with some type of tracking, technology made its way into that room. The very first spinning class that I ever took was in a abandoned bread factory in Santa Monica, California, where John Bodwin and Johnny G started it all. And it was Johnny on a bike with a bunch of candles. And it was an amazing thing, like having never done it before and being an ex-athlete, it was amazing. It was an amazing experience. Fast forward to today, the experience has to be the same. It has to be, mind altering, but now it's done differently. It's not candles and music alone. It's lighting. It's the stereo. It's the music you choose. It's the leaderboard technology that allows you to display everyone's work rate and everyone's progress. And then it's even capturing that data after the class so that 45 minutes later, I can send you an email and say, thank you for coming. Here's what you accomplished today. The greatest thing and the worst thing that ever happened from a product development standpoint is we put technology on a bike.
Yeah.
Before that, from a product standpoint, it was a very easy product to make. It was easy to install. It was inexpensive to ship. Everything about it checked the box for kind of product management. As we've introduced technology, it's gotten harder and harder to keep up with, because better than anybody, technology literally moves at the speed of light and sound at this point. And when you're dealing with capital equipment and technology, most customers want to buy a piece of capital equipment, a group cycle, a treadmill, an upright bike for the cardio floor. And their mentality is, I'm going to keep this bike for 5 years, 7 years, maybe. So anything I try to put on that bike this year is probably obsolete 2 years later.
Yep.
I mean, that's the ultimate challenge of technology and product management. But group cycling has been a fascinating thing to watch, because right now is an interesting time coming out of COVID. The Peloton effect during COVID was massive, and it was Peloton, and it was Mix, and it was Echelon, and it was anyone that had a group cycle with a screen on it. And to emphasize the impact that COVID had, and Bryan, you're aware of this, but I worked for a company in 2010, which was in fact the first company that ever produced a group cycle with a 15-inch touchscreen on it. So I get horrible marks for timing, because I was 10 years too early. But the reality is it changed the perception. The idea of an instructor leading you virtually on a bike changed during COVID. And I think it feeds into what you asked is what's happened with group cycling. The perfect group cycling environment is that environment today that caters to the class or the user in that class to their favorite thing. For some people, it's still today is dance on a bike.
Yep.
And it's choreography and it's music and it's rhythm. But there's a whole nother generation now that is into power and tracking their data and showing performance workout over workout and creating a gamified experience in the room with racing and targets and different prizes. So it's, I think what's hard for an operator today to wrap their head around is how can I be everything to every one of those riders? They try to do it with their schedule, but often they haven't designed the environment that allows them every hour to shift gears and cater to a new rider, a new consumer.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Jeff. What about treadmills and ellipticals and other forms of cardio? I mean, embedded screens, all these things we've seen. And then are users still, BYOD bringing their own device? Or is it like cycling where you have this whole mismatch of different people wanting different stuff? I mean, what are your views on cardio in general outside of indoor cycling?
It's a great question because the part of this shift that's happening now, this renaissance of strength training, is having an impact on cardio. Going back to where I was earlier in the story of gyms originally not even having cardio to getting into the 80s and 90s when cardio was introduced and the first StairMaster came out and the first pre-core elliptical and treadmills became mainstream in health clubs. It's been an evolution. You could argue that in the late 90s, early 2000s, cardio was king. And the mentality at that time, if you remember the science at that time, it was long, sustained effort, cardio for aerobic, health. And, as an operator, we all had that member that would come in with a newspaper, would get on a recumbent bike, would put it on level 4, and would read the newspaper for 40 minutes. The good news is they were moving. The bad news is they were never changing, right? So there wasn't an evolution. Fast forward to today where working out hard is about as popular as it's ever been. It's about as mainstream as it's ever been. The greatest example of that might be treadmills and stair climbers. Treadmills have always kind of taken a front row position in the clubs. And even when it was in vogue to do long, low intensity exercise, treadmills were great because most people on treadmills were walking. And if you remember back then, there was a back aisle in most clubs. And in the back aisle, in the back where the crazy people trained, was a StairMaster, was a Versa climber, was a Concept 2 rower. And that was where you went if you were a different kind of character. You were there to sweat and you were there to get your heart rate up. Contrast that to today. All 3 of those things are in the front row. And the most popular programs that are being used on cardio equipment aren't, long sustained duration, low intensity cardio. It's HIIT training. It's short interval training. It's hill training. So science, social media has basically educated the world that it's okay to work hard. And in fact, the science probably supports that interval training is one of the best ways to train. And it's very in style and vogue to work hard. Social media is driving this at a level that is almost hard for me to keep track of. When I go into one of our larger customers' facilities and I see step and repeat walls that are specifically for people to do social media filming, and I see tripods in front of half racks, it's amazing to watch. I mean, Bryan, you probably remember when we first started opening clubs, really big high-end clubs, in the late 90s, cell phones were just coming on the scene and you weren't allowed to have your cell phone in the gym. It was considered a distraction. Imagine if you were a club owner today and you set that same policy, you'd be out of business.
That's right. You'd be way out of business, right?
Right.
That's fascinating. And with respect to that, congrats, StairMaster, which is arguably one of the best known brands in the commercial fitness space. 40 years this year. That's how long it is. That makes me feel old, Jeff.
Yeah, you and me both. I think I was, at that time I was in club operations. And so I remember those guys. And when I say those guys, the StairMaster guy, the Precor guy, the VersaClimber guy, the treadmill guy, the, Augie and the Life Cycle. I remember those guys coming to meet with us to pitch us on these great new things. And so it's rare that you have something that was created 40 years ago that is more popular today than it's ever been in its 40-year history. For many years, StairMaster had a patent on the StairMaster. And if you wanted a StairMaster, you had to call StairMaster to get it. And it was a scary time when that patent expired because we knew everyone would get into that category. But the reality of that year or that 2 years when the patent expired was the culture shift had already begun. Working out hard was what everyone wanted to do. And so ironically, when all the other stair climbers launched, there was a massive media event that happened for 12 months where stair climbers were in every publication. They were in every web banner ad. And in fact, it was the highest revenue year in the history of StairMaster, was the year that its patent expired. And it's been an uphill, kind of fun ride ever since. If you look at the FISA data, stair climbers have been the most consistent and highest percentage per year growth cardio unit on the floor today. In general, treadmills still growing. Pre and post COVID, if you go back about 6 or 7 years, there's a trend of growth. Stair climbers definitely growing. Ellipticals are flat, and it's an interesting look when you dig into the data, because the traditional elliptical, if you think about what Precor created in that category, the 18 to 20 inch fixed stride ramp upper body, that is actually still very strong. And a lot of people are keeping that as a mainstream machine in their cardio line. Where we've seen the drop off in the data is the alternative cardio. Whether it's circular motion or a lateral motion or a user-defined motion, doesn't matter who the manufacturer is, we're seeing those kind of experimental categories drop off. People are sticking with what's driving usage, and that's treadmills, stair climbers, ellipticals. Bikes have been flat for a while. The bike category is interesting. Recumbent bikes, you'll see a little year-over-year growth still. Upright bikes has been the biggest change because the move away from the traditional electronic upright bike and towards a bike with a screen with virtual training on it has been the shift. Where you used to see 6 bikes, you started to see 2 bikes, 2 espresso bikes, and 2 bikes with screens. And now the shift is even more towards, whether it's, again, a virtual experience or it's a instructor-led experience on the bike. We're seeing more of those on the cardio floor than ever.
Yeah.
If a facility is trying to figure out how to make more room in other areas, we're seeing cardio go down a little bit in certain categories. So it's an interesting time. People are having to reinvent their floor plans and their space plans.
Yeah. And as you had mentioned before, I want to get into a couple other areas on this. And thanks so much. These are great insights, Jeff. And I know our audience really appreciates your wisdom and insight around these things. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, of course, strength itself. I mean, nobody is going to a club today that hasn't seen this shift, unless it's maybe a mainstream kind of Planet, which, they are shifting up their offerings. But on mainstream clubs like the club I go through to Stone Creek, they've reconfigured their floor space significantly. The number of racks has gone up tremendously. you see just a lot more people utilizing strength than ever before. I know the science has been part of this. Tell us what's going on with that and driving it, in your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to go back to the science for a lot of things, because if you look at the origin of a lot of things, it's often based on the reality of what that thing does in real life. And if you go back even 5 or 10 years, you're starting to see different organizations, ACSM and others, emphasizing the importance of strength. And certainly with the research that's being done in older adults, you're seeing even a bigger emphasis put on for adults over 50 to maintain some type of strength program, to maintain lean mass and all the things that are good that come with that. On the gym floor itself, on the facility floor itself, Bryan, it is amazing what you're describing, because I see the same thing when I go to clubs and we have customers that come into our facility every month. We spend a week, a month with customers in our facility doing exactly this type of discussion. And to know now that something like an Olympic lifting platform and half rack, which 10 years ago, a lot of clubs wouldn't allow. 10 years ago, you would have probably never seen in a YMCA. 10 years ago, you would have for sure never seen that in a multi-housing fitness center. Half racks are going into all those now.
Yeah.
And in the commercial clubs, you're seeing anywhere from 4 to sometimes 10 to sometimes 12 half racks.
Unbelievable.
And it is, yeah, and it's not only is it just nonstop usage. The other thing that's really fascinating to me about what's going on in the strength training part of the facility now is the demographic has shifted too. We did an informal audit of a very large club near our office, and it sees about 3,300 workouts a day, so it's busy. They have 8 of our half racks and platforms. And we thought it would be interesting to do a traffic flow study to see not only how often were they being used, but who was using them. And the fascinating thing is they were never not used. There was not a time in this facility where those half racks were not in use. What was interesting to me is in actual head count, more women were using that area than men. Again, not what I think I would have seen 10 or 15 years ago. The reason was the men were all training individually. The women were training predominantly in pairs with workout partners, or sometimes in groups of 3. And the other thing that's interesting about that area is it's not one and done. You don't go into that area and do 3 sets of squats and leave. You go to that area and you do deadlifts, you do squats, you might do push presses, you might do cleans, you might do all the other popular movements that are going on. And I think facility operators are realizing that. And that's why we're seeing the numbers grow. Because it's not a chest press where someone can work in with you necessarily and get moving down the line. Right. And there's other changes in the strength area that are interesting as well. Selectorized strength is actually down a little bit because of the rise of plate loaded and free weights. Now, there's still a ton of science to support individual selectorized station training. I mean, it absolutely has a place. In the old days, though, it was an 18-piece circuit. Some of us even have 22-piece body part circuits. And instead of an 18-piece circuit, it's a 16 or a 14-piece now, because they're making space for other things. If I was ever going to point at a very interesting phenomenon, we have a product in the Nautilus line called the Glute Drive, and a lot of other manufacturers make a hip thrust machine. But when you talk about the change in culture, I think, Bryan, you would agree, 10 years ago, doing a hip thrust in the gym would have probably not been socially acceptable.
That's correct.
And it's the ultimate science driving trend. There's a guy, originally based in San Diego, I think now in Arizona, Brett Contreras, who devoted 8 years of his life to studying the hip thrust and validating the effectiveness of it. There's a physical therapist in Colorado named Pete Holman, who loved it too, and loved the education of it, and loved the movement, and created a prototype. There's another guy in Chicago, another physical therapist named Mike Kordecki, who was on the same path. And all these things were converging. And as the education and as guys like Brett were out presenting to trainers and presenting at NSCA, this influx of education was getting out into the trainer world. And what happened is you saw Olympic bars start disappearing from squat racks and bench press stations. And it created havoc in the gym. People were balancing a 45-pound Olympic bar across their hips. Everyone wanted to do that motion. It was suddenly socially acceptable. It just wasn't practical in most facilities. And so as an industry, we jumped on it. We created these hip thrust machines. But it is one of those things where now it's rare that I walk into a facility that doesn't have a hip thrust machine. And we love it because the Nautilus Good Drive was on the beginning of that wave, but it's as commonplace as an Olympic bench press at this point.
It really is.
And so that was, that was the trainers driving it up through the owners, because I'm sure the first time that a YMCA CEO or an owner of a chain of health clubs was asked by their trainer to buy a hip thrust machine, the answer was no. But now it's undeniable. You have to have it. You have to answer that need in the freeway area.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, Jeff. What do you see given these key trends? And we touched on tracking a little bit, that's a whole conversation as that continues to evolve. And we could talk about that. We talked about, these other components that you're mentioning, strength, cardio, indoor cycling, et cetera. What are you seeing in the realm of content, apps, and all these kind of other dynamics and the omni-channel concept? Because I know during COVID, that really kind of spiked a lot. And now, as far as the member journey goes and how customers or members are interfacing with brands, both in club and out, you see Basic Fit selling bikes that through their bricks and mortar clubs for both in-home training and in-club training. Do you see that as kind of just a component? Was it a little faddish? Do you see it continuing to evolve? What do you see there?
Well, first of all, I'm talking to the expert on this, so I'm a bit of a rookie when it comes to omnichannel. But here's what I know. I mean, where I think it was very prevalent, even pre-COVID, was for facility operators was in the group cycling studio. You had a space, a dedicated space in your facility, but you knew that you could only really program that space maybe 4 or 5, if you're really good, maybe 6 hours a day. And the other 10 or 12 hours, that room sat empty. And, if Bryan O'Rourke is my favorite 6 a.m. group cycling instructor, and I can't get there at 6, I'm just frustrated. And we saw it even pre-COVID. Even companies like Wexer that is now part of Core, but other companies too, that were taking advantage of that space and saying, look, we offer group cycling every hour that our facility is open. Here are the live classes. Here are the virtual classes, but you can take a group cycling class anytime you want. And I think in that space, it was accepted and people like, that makes sense. That room wouldn't be used otherwise. I think the biggest shift I saw in COVID was an acceleration of, and other people have used this phrase, but it's an acceleration of what consumers demand. And it's I want what I want when I want it, right? Like in every aspect of my life. I want groceries, Amazon sends me groceries. I want a movie, Netflix gives me a movie. And I think it's the same with fitness. I think the explosion of virtual fitness that happened in that time was people were desperate for exercise and they couldn't do it in a traditional fashion. So I guess if we had this conversation in 2018 or 2019, I would have probably said, look, my sense is only 20% of most facility members would even watch a virtual video inside of the health club. It would be like me going to church on Sunday and watching church on the big screen versus actually having a pastor up on stage talking to me. But I think during COVID, that changed. The acceptance of virtual fitness changed. And now the thought of look, I don't consider myself an ultra techie guy, but I enjoy the fact that I can open my Wexer app on a Sunday when I'm in a hotel in, you know, Orlando, Florida, and I can do a yoga class, or I can do a breathing class, or I can, do a quick hit core workout. And I think it's here to stay.
Yeah.
And I think, we're seeing different companies address it in different ways. I think hybrid programming is, if you have a facility today and you're not maximizing all your space, all the hours that you're open, I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
If you're not connecting with your members, if I'm a club owner, I would love to go to sleep at night thinking that I am your fitness resource, that anytime you need fitness, you come to me. And that is sometimes inside of my brick and mortar building. And that is maybe going to my app on a Sunday afternoon to do a relaxation and mobility class. But I want my brand to be prevalent in your mind. And so I think every facility operator has to be thinking that way, is how do I stay connected with my client?
Yeah. That's a great answer. And as I said in the intro, we're going to get to a final question or two, Jeff. Thanks again for making time. As I mentioned in the intro, it's great to talk to somebody that's been a part of really inventing all these things that are now mainstream that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, people wouldn't even have thought would be, it didn't even occur to them. So I find the conversation so fascinating. In light of that, because you've dealt with a lot of inventors, you've dealt with a lot of new products and new ideas over the years. Before I knew you, and I think we've known each other for maybe 16 years or more, but what are some pearls of wisdom or advice that you'd give people who are trying to come up with what in the business itself, either coming up with new ideas or operating clubs, what kind of items would you say they should make sure stay on the forefront of their mind when it comes to what they're doing in the future? Big question.
Well, I think from an operator standpoint, if you've got to constantly be listening, right? It's voice of customer is such a powerful thing, and I find myself often, I love to just listen to people and understand how they're presenting information and what's relevant to them. I think facility operators today, it's once you find a formula, man, you want to ride that formula as long as you can. And the mistake I see people making is they ride a formula for too long. Reinvention is a scary thing, and having your finger on the pulse of trends and things that are happening means change, and change is hard. But I think if you really look at some of the innovators in fitness in general, they do a really nice job of paying attention to the trends. You don't have to be the early adopter, but you probably should be the fast follower when you know something is working. And what's always hard to me is that person that waits too long, that operator that waits too long to change. At the end of the day, is it expensive? Absolutely, it is. But it's capital equipment. It's tearing some walls down. It's throwing some flooring on the floor. You build it into your budget. You build it into your financial plan, and your members will love you for it. And your new members will be attracted to you for it. Think of, I love the story of Everlast in Europe. What an interesting thing to happen to that brand. Everlast, you think New York, you think boxing, you don't think cutting edge clubs in Europe. But they've turned Europe upside down because the evolution has been, kind of traditional clubs, and then there was the adoption of the low price clubs with the bright colors and but it's kind of the same floor plan. And then there's a few innovators over there, Everlast being one of a few, that said, no, we're gonna pay attention to what consumers are asking for, what's in style, what's happening in the design world, what's happening in the lighting world, what's happening in the architectural world, and we're going to build some facilities that are going to be completely different. I had the opportunity to sit with the buyer for Everlast, and as they were opening their new clubs, he said, Jeff, one of the things that's driving me crazy is how many competitor tours we do a day, people coming in to check out what we're doing. And I'm a huge advocate of that. Know what's going on in the market, travel a little bit, get into other clubs. One of my favorite things to do, believe it or not, after 40 years, is if I'm in a city, I love just going and finding a gym.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a gym I know nothing about, but I walk in there and I can't think of a time when I haven't walked out saying, wow, that was cool, or wow, I never thought to do that. And I think people have to be open to that,
Yep.
and they have to be willing to reinvent themselves.
Yep. That's so true, Jeff. And, to your point, I'm always fascinated because, the modern health club industry is globally has really been seen as US centric. But one of the reasons you mentioned Everlast in Europe, one of the reasons that I love going to FIBO and spend a lot of time in Asia and Europe, like you get to do, is you see these operations that are just completely different and innovative, and nothing like it
Right.
exists in our backyard around here. And boy, do you really learn a lot when you spend time doing what you describe.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, I go back to voice of customer. One of the things I have the chance to meet a lot of people that are operating facilities and different types of facilities. And, one of the questions I always ask them is, when was the last time you pulled yourself out of the business and you became a member of your own facility? When was the last time you went out and spent 2 or 3 hours on the floor, working out, meeting and greeting? The value of that is completely underrated, and it's something that someone should build into their schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can do it, you need to do it. I'm a believer in what you just described. Well, listeners, as I said in the intro, and I'll mention again, we will have Jeff's profiles in the show notes, so check him out. And I love following you on MyZone. Every day almost. I think we share each other's workouts, and I love it.
You're my accountability partner.
Yeah, you're from kayaking to getting on the bike you're testing out to doing all the different things you do. It's a pleasure both to know you and follow you there. And I know being one of the leading innovators in the space, a lot of people really will enjoy your observations and thoughts. So thank you, Jeff, for making time.
Bryan, thank you. It's great to be on. I always enjoy listening to the podcast and spending time with you. So yeah, look forward to next time we see each other.
Yes, my friend. Take care and thanks again.
All right, Bryan. Thanks.
Hello, listeners. This is Bryan O'Rourke, and thanks so much for listening to the Fitness Plus Technology Podcast. The podcast is made possible by the Fitness Industry Technology Council, a consortium of global brands working together to enhance the adoption of technologies in the fitness space. Our company, Videri Ventures, which is invested in Vertimax, Montezuma, Gold's Gym Houston, Texas, and Fitness 24/7 Thailand, also underwrites the podcast, along with our service companies, Integris Advisors, Moon Mission Media, and others. Please feel free to share this podcast with your colleagues. And if I can be of any assistance to you, don't hesitate to reach out, bryanko'rourke@gmail.com, or find me on any of the major social networks. Have a great day, and thanks for listening.